todos, todes. Santiago me invitó a presentar el protagonista de la noche y acompañar un poco como traductor en el caso de que hay un problema con la inteligencia artificial que tenemos prendida para traducir lo que Hans-Peter va a comentar. Soy Patrick Eser, estoy trabajando acá para el DAAD, el Servicio Alemán de Intercambio Académicos, en la Cátedra Libre Walter Benjamin que funciona en la UBA. Y yo estoy a cargo de eso y gracias por la invitación, un gran honor de ser traductor acá. Presento Hans-Peter Gruber brevemente. Hans-Peter estaba estudiando en Berlín, en la Universidad de Berlín, historia, y filosofía y ciencias políticas. Y ahí estuvo también realizando la tesis doctoral sobre Félix Weil, de la que surgió el libro que va a presentar hoy, las investigaciones. Presentó la tesis en la Technische Universität, la Universidad Técnica de Berlín, donde hay un centro de investigaciones sobre antisemitismo. Ahí presentó en 2020 esa investigación y ahora está trabajando en la Universidad de Estudios Judíos en Heidelberg y también en el Archivo Central para la Investigación de la Historia Judía en Alemania del Sur, también en Heidelberg. Y quizás lo que también es interesante saber que Hans-Peter estaba trabajando también a nivel de organizaciones culturales, asociaciones que se dedicaban de rescatar o trabajar sobre el legado cultural de la vida judía en el, básicamente en el suroeste de Alemania. Y ahí también hubo un caso de una sinagoga en Neidenstein, donde él estuvo muy comprometido a nivel local de trabajar sobre el legado cultural de esa sinagoga. Bueno, no voy a decir mucho más porque el libro va a presentar él y bueno, la idea es, claro, you will have your talk in English and we will have a translation, eso. Y bueno, y si hace falta que yo intervengo, ahora me corro, pero estoy acá para ayudar si hay problemas con lo de inglés al castellano. Bueno.
So, good evening everybody and thank you very much for being here. And many thanks for the organization and invitation to today's conference, and very especially to Santiago. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm very pleased to be here in Buenos Aires today to talk about Félix Weil, because Argentina was sure of great importance in his life. And conversely, Félix Weil also left a remarkable mark on his country of birth. But first of all, does it work?
Yes.
Okay. However, today I would like to take a look at Félix Weil as a whole, rather than just presenting him as the enigmático argentino, because you can only understand him if you consider his entire life. The question of what drove him and what goals he wanted to achieve can only be understood by looking at his multifaceted biography, spanning 3 continents. So today I would like to talk about the enigmático cosmopolita, and it's precisely when you look at the whole person that you can ultimately solve some of the enigmas. However, there is one clear focal point in his life, and that's the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, which we can also see here, but I fear we don't see much. Is it possible to...
Turn the light on. There's just
Okay. That's the institute, the first institute we see here, which was opened in 1924. And although this institute, like its founder, Félix Weil, has had a very eventful history, he remained associated with it from its founding in 1923 until his death in 1975. And even in times when he moved away from the institute, both geographically and intellectually, he was always drawn back to it. And that is why I am returning to the institute again and again this evening. I myself, I'm a historian, specializing in Jewish history, as Patrick told you, and I have studied Félix Weil from a historical perspective, and this involves researching, reconstructing, and historically contextualizing the life of Félix Weil on the basis of a critical analysis of the available sources. First, however, I would like to discuss the title of my presentation today, Out of the Ordinary, and I would like briefly to explain how I came to be interested in the life of Félix Weil. Out of the Ordinary, maybe you see it is in quotation marks because it's a quote from Félix Weil. Specifically, it's the translation of the original German quote, aus der Art geschlagen. He himself summed up his life with these 4 words, and it would be hard to put it more aptly. He is referring to a fundamental tension in his life. On the one hand, Félix Weil was already very wealthy as a young man. Together with his sister Anita, he was the main heir of a huge grain trading company, the Weil Hermanos y Compañía, headquartered here in Buenos Aires. At the request of his father, Hermann Weil, he was to continue running the company in the role of a general director, and he repeatedly worked in a management capacity. On the other hand, he hated the grain trade as an immoral business. So he stated very clearly, speculating with the people's daily bread was repugnant to me. He also writes that he had no talent for it, that unlike his father, he was completely unsuited to it. But that's not true. On the contrary, he often proved in practice that he was very well suited to it. He also had the best prerequisites for it, and he had studied political science, earned a doctorate, and was considered a very capable economist. But he simply had completely different interests. He was a Marxist, he was a socialist, and until the end of his life, he spent almost all his money, a huge fortune, on his political ideas, including the Institute of Social Research with its Marxist orientation. And thus, he was completely out of the ordinary. My own incentive to examine the life and work of Félix Weil was also, at least to some extent, out of the ordinary. While supporting a school project researching the Jewish history of the Kraichgau region, I came across a very special source. The Kraichgau region was a center of German rural Judaism, and Félix Weil's paternal ancestors, a long-established Jewish family, can be traced back to 1722. Here on this map of Germany, you can see that this region is located in the southwest. You can see here the dark gray area, that's Kraichgau, and the small little dot, I don't know if you can see it, that's Steinsfurt, that's the village the family comes from. For many generations, the Weil family was engaged in typical Jewish occupations there, trading in agricultural products, livestock, and horses. Here in the photo on the left side, we can also see the family's house, which also had a shop. The paternal line of Félix Weil can be traced back 6 generations at a large Jewish cemetery in neighboring Weibstadt. You see it here on the left side. And there are more than 100 graves of the family members of his ancestors. And Hermann Weil also had a mausoleum built there, where his urn and that of his wife were kept until the November pogroms, and when the mausoleum was desecrated and the urns were stolen. The mausoleum, you see it here on the right side. In 2010, the founder and director of this school project, Siegfried Bastel, gave me a plastic bag containing a disorderly bundle of papers. He himself had received this bag in the USA at a meeting of the Weil family. And looking through these papers triggered a very special impulse in me, because this plastic bag contained a large part of Félix Weil's unpublished autobiography. At that time, I didn't know much about him, in fact, nothing at all. And now, from these 340 pages, a multi-layered personality emerged with a very diversified but also equally exciting biography. However, it was above all a life torn apart by the political catastrophes of the 20th century, a life uprooted, and I was quickly inspired to search for the common thread that held it together. And I was highly excited. It was highly exciting for me to find a contract between Félix Weil and the publishing house Fischer Verlag in this plastic bag. Contract, which you see here, the first and the last side, that had already been signed by both parties in 1975. Félix Weil signed it, seen here on the right. That's his signature. He signed it on April 24th, 1975, at his last place of residence, Dover, Delaware, in the United States. And as can be here seen on the left side, that's the first page of the contract. It should be published under the title. I think you cannot read it, but the title is written here. It's aus der Art geschlagen, out of the ordinary. And the subtitle is also quite interesting. It's Erinnerungen eines roten Millionärssohnes, meaning memories of a red millionaire's son. However, his memories remained unpublished because Félix Weil died on September 18th, 1975, shortly before he could finish his book. His wife Anna then made final changes to the manuscript for about 2 weeks and sent it to the publisher, until she also died in early October 1975. Here we see Anna and Félix Weil at Frankfurt Airport in January 1969. This was the time when Félix Weil began writing his autobiography. And after both of them had died, Félix Weil's son, Frank, made great efforts to have the book published, which he regarded as a monument to his father. This photo of father and son was taken when Félix Weil lived in Morteau in southern France for a year 1937, and Frank attended boarding school in Switzerland. Frank was Félix Weil's only child, born from his first marriage to Käthe Bacher. Fischer Verlag finally rejected the manuscript for publication, and I would like to quote the 3 key sentences from their rejection letter. But the author is dead. He can no longer be interviewed. The manuscript is therefore unusable for publication. This is very strongly worded, and this rejection motivated me even more to make the autobiography known. But I should add that the print-ready manuscript has been lost. The plastic bag contained an earlier version that was well advanced, but still contained many handwritten corrections and comments. But this makes it all the more valuable because it allows it to trace the development of ideas. These are very typical pages with corrections, or even with corrections of corrections and longer handwritten passages. Or we have smaller notes with additions, which we referred to as inserts. During my first research on Félix Weil, I discovered that his life had hardly been explored up to that point. And I was especially surprised that in publications about the Institute for Social Research, Félix Weil was often only mentioned in passing, in a distorted role, or not at all. Yet he had played a key role in designing, founding, and building up the Institute with great personal commitment. He had conducted the complicated and difficult negotiations with the Prussian Ministry of Culture and the university. And above all, he had invested a large part of his fortune by buying the building site and financing the construction and all the equipment. It is also a remarkable detail that he persuaded his father to finance the ongoing operations with the foundation. This is noteworthy because Hermann Weil was a conservative imperial royalist and member of the upper class. And during the First World War, he had written export reports for the highest military and political authorities, which were then jointly responsible for the start of unrestricted submarine warfare. And now he was helping to finance a Marxist institute. Félix Weil, in any case, described the institute as his life's work. He was therefore not a reclusive benefactor, but was present, active, and involved in shaping it. Here on the right, in this upper row photos, we see him in his office at the Institute. This was the administrative office which he himself took over. Below we see Friedrich Pollock in his office, who also belonged to the first generation of Institute members. Félix Weil also made it one of his main tasks to establish a special library on the history and theory of socialism and the labor movement, which grew up to 42,000 volumes by 1929 and also had a unique archive. He was also the driving force behind the collaboration with the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow from 1924 to 1929 to prepare the first complete edition of the Marx and Engels works. However, Félix Weil hardly taught at the Institute at all, as he had to step in too often at his father's company, whether here in Buenos Aires or at the European branches. And this made regular teaching almost impossible. The fact that Félix Weil's role was overshadowed is all the more surprising because it was such a special institute. The institute gave rise to critical theory of Frankfurt School, which became world famous with figures such as Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, Löwenthal, Fromm, and a generation later, Habermas. The institute thus gained enormous prestige, while its founder, Félix Weil, faded into background. Instead, other persons assigned themselves roles which don't correspond to the facts. In later retrospectives, Friedrich Pollock and Max Horkheimer counted themselves to the Institute's founders. Pollock was present in the early period of the Institute and played an active and important role, but he was by no means its founder. And although Max Horkheimer, whom we can see here, and although Max Horkheimer became director of the Institute in 1930 at the instigation of Félix Weil, and then drove forward a development that culminated in critical theory, he was virtually absent during the founding and early phases. And this was another incentive for my research work to correct this distorted picture. When you look at Félix Weil as a whole, and not just as the founder of the Institute, you are faced with the challenge that he took on many different roles in his life, some of which, at least at first glance, seem contradictory or even puzzling. He was a Marxist, a revolutionary, and he was a delegate of the Communist International for South America. On the other hand, he also worked for an anti-communist right-wing government in Argentina. He supported the Democratic Party in California, and in his later years, he became a member of the US Army in the Federal Republic of Germany. And last not least, he was a businessman when he worked for Weil Hermanos y Compañía. These are just a few examples. In addition, as mentioned at the beginning, Félix Weil was a cosmopolitan. This was largely out of necessity, as he was persecuted by the National Socialists for two reasons. for his political convictions and for his Jewish descent. Until the end of his life, he often communed between continents, between Europe, North and South America, and he could not be tied to any one country or city. He felt the strongest affinity for Frankfurt, where he lived for almost 20 years. But he was not German, he was Argentine, and became an American citizen in 1946. Félix Weil's 5 marriages are also worth mentioning, but I will not go into detail about them. I'm historian, and that's a totally different field of expertise. And however, I can assure you, and that is why I mentioned it, that these 5 marriages and 4 divorces did not make his complicated life any easier. In my research, I looked for the common thread that held this life together and could explain it. The question is, what constants can be identified in his life? And first of all, there are his political convictions, which he never abandoned. After finding his political convictions at a young age, Félix Weil remained a Marxist and socialist throughout his life. The crucial point is that something else must be added, because he saw himself as an unorthodox Marxist and undogmatic socialist. And this is an important point, because it allowed him to react flexibly to developments he rejected and to act pragmatically. After its founding in January 1919, he was close to the Communist Party of Germany and soon gravitated toward the right wing. However, the increasing Bolshevization and Stalinization of the party quickly led to a departure. And as a consequence, he was, as he stated, and as far as I know, he was never a member of the Communist Party, nor of any other political party. Félix Weil also took an undogmatic approach to solving an economic problem he saw in socialism. He recognized early on, it must have been around 1920, that a centrally planned economy could not work very good. Without a market, there is no economy, was his basic assumption. And he was convinced that every economy, including a socialist one, needs a regulating market. So Félix Weil was faced with a fundamental problem. He was a socialist, but he rejected one of the pillars of this ideology, the centrally planned economy. And he went even further. He considered capitalist economic models to be superior in economic terms. And as a solution, he tended toward ideas of economic democracy. He apparently saw the solution in consumer cooperatives that would compete with each other. And there's a second constant in Félix Weil biography, and this is the belief in the power of education, formation, and enlightenment. And for Félix Weil, these were the only meaningful means of promoting and implementing political ideas. And then there's also his Jewish descent, but more as a passive constant, as a framework, since Félix Weil denied that Judaism had any influence on his life. He understood Judaism exclusively as a belief system, and as an atheist, he had nothing to do with it. He came from a non-religious home, and his family did not belong to any Jewish community. And as he wrote, he did not undergo any religious ceremonies. To the horror of his relatives here in Buenos Aires, he was not circumcised. But on the other hand, he was not baptized either, as sometimes is stated. There's also a statement about this non-religious home. We only observed 2 things from Judaism at home: Christmas and the Frankfurter Zeitung. Frankfurter Zeitung, I should add that this was a liberal daily newspaper with many Jewish editors. In any case, this is ironic distance, but complete distance from Judaism. Nevertheless, Félix Weil's Jewish descent was formative and also present in his life. His biography remains incomprehensible without the Jewish context, without its embedding in Jewish history. This applies to his family history, which is fundamental to a biography, and of course it applies to him himself, especially when one considers his life, but also his immediate environment. But he also expressed his serious views on this in this correspondence with Martin Jay, who published The Dialectical Imagination in 1973, the first standard work of the Institute. Félix Weil read the manuscript pages repeatedly and found the book quite good. However, he was bothered by Martin Jay's focus on Jewish origins and asked, why do you feel the need to stress whenever you introduce a new character that he is or was Jewish? For Félix Weil, it was completely irrelevant that a striking number of the Institute's members were of Jewish origin. He also made his views clear on this point. I most emphatically stress that the Jewish origins of most members of the Institute group were mere coincidence. I insist that you omit the Jewish references. And finally, he came to a decisive conclusion. Now, I see it's not good to read. Can you read it? Okay. Now, he came to this conclusion. Now the question is whether you understand Jewish as a religion or a race or nationality. I can't imagine you, like Hitler, consider it a race. For Félix Weil, in this sense, Judaism was therefore a religion, or in a legitimate, or in an, for Félix Weil, Judaism was therefore a religion in a legitimate sense, or an instrument of racial ideology in an illegitimate sense. This is all very clearly formulated, but elsewhere Félix Weil took a more differentiated view of his Jewish descent. Despite all my sympathy for Israel, I still don't feel like a Jew, although I know where I come from, and I would never pretend to be a Goy. This is the strongest statement, the key sentence that Félix Weil wrote about his relationship to Judaism. First of all, it is important to note the date. It's a quote from August 1971. He expressed sympathy for Israel at a time when the New Left already regarded Israel as an imperialist state and classified the interests of the Palestinians as part of the global anti-colonial liberation movements. But the most important thing is that he knows his origins. He's well aware of his Jewish descent, and he doesn't want to give the impression that he is not Jewish. And in doing so, he himself expresses the formative influence that Judaism had on him, even though he remained an atheist throughout his life. But now to the question of how Félix Weil came to his political convictions, which then led him to found a Marxist institute. Why did he become a socialist? Why did he become a Marxist? If we take a look at his family background, his path to socialism seems somewhat unusual. This is an early photograph of Félix Weil's parents, Rosa Weissmann and Hermann Weil, taken 1896 in Mannheim, Germany. It's probably their wedding photo. Rosa Weissmann also came from a German Jewish family that can be traced back many generations. Her father, Isidor Weissmann, had founded a grain wholesale business in Mannheim, where Hermann Weil completed his training and gained his first professional experience. This laid the foundation for him to move to Argentina around 1890, where he first established a branch office for a Dutch grain trading company and then, together with two older brothers, founded his own company, Weil Hermanos de Compañía, which quickly became one of the world market leaders in grain trading. Can I have some more? Here we see the three brothers, Samuel, Hermann and Ferdinand Weil in 1900, when the company's meteoric rise was already in full swing. Felix Weil was born in Buenos Aires on February the 8th in 1898, the year the company was founded, and grew up there in very affluent circumstances. Their lifestyle included a villa in the city, a country estate in the mountains near Mendoza, an English-speaking governess for the two children, a French-speaking maid for the mother, and domestic staff for the household. This early family photo, taken in Buenos Aires around 1904, reflects the upper-class self-confidence very well. On the left, we see Hermann Weil with Felix Weil. On the right, Rosa Weissmann with her daughter Anita, who was 3.5 years younger than her brother. Felix Weil summed up his childhood in Argentina as follows. So that was how and where I spent the first years of my life, as son of the boss of a large company with branches in Rotterdam, Frankfurt, Mannheim, Copenhagen, Genua, London, and hundreds of branches in Argentina. Son of the boss, a wording which expresses a certain distance. In another version of this passage from his autobiography, Felix Weil replaced son of the boss with crown prince, but that is no less distant. Nothing changed in this upper-class atmosphere when the Weil family moved to Frankfurt in 1907 and 1908. For the first 5 years, the family lived in a suite at the Hotel Imperial on Opernplatz, the most elegant hotel in the city, until they moved in the newly built villa at Zeppelinallee 77 in 1913, the street of the successful, as Felix Weil called it. The house still stands today in its original form. Felix Weil also made a comment about this family villa that expresses the prosperity associated with it. The house was huge and stood in a large garden comprising 3 plots of land. On the 4th plot, on Hans-Sachs-Straße, were the garages for our 4 cars and apartments for 2 married chauffeurs. Hermann Weil was enthusiastic about modern means of transportation and had a soft spot for the latest cars from the car producer Benz. Here in this photo we can see him in one of these cars with his nurse Steffi Kraut. This photo was also taken at that time during a horseback ride on November the 24th, 1912, on Anita's 11th birthday. Felix Weil, 14 years old, is the second rider from the left, followed by his sister Anita. And this photo, it's hard to see. It's a photo of a family gathering in the villa's garden, taken around 1925. Hermann Weil is sitting in the front. He's visibly marked by his illness, and in the photo one can see here we have Felix Weil and 2 persons to the right. There is Anita Weil. When you consider this family background, this upper-class environment, first in Buenos Aires, then in Frankfurt, the question arises how and why Felix Weil became a socialist. He was completely out of step with his extended family, at least in his generation. He himself established a close connection with the November Revolution. This photo of the Hotel Frankfurter Hof was taken on November 9, 1918, the day of the abdication of the German Emperor Wilhelm II. The Frankfurt Workers' and Soldiers' Council had taken up residence here, and on that very day Felix Weil went there wearing the colors of his student fraternity and joined the November Revolution, together with another fraternity member. And this is also rather unusual, as students hardly participated in November Revolution. It has even been called a revolution without students. In any case, the next day he came across to this brochure. It's the Erfurt program of the Social Democratic Party from 1891, which drew heavily on Marxism. Félix Weil refers to this as his key political experience. What he himself wrote about it is one of the most important passages in his autobiography. In the morning, I realized that I was out of the ordinary. I, only 20 years old, was the main heir of a very sick man and, as such, also co-owner of a company with dozens of branches around the world, which employed a few thousand families. But I was, yes, I could hardly believe it, but I had just discovered it. I was a socialist. There it was, in black and white, everything I had considered right and necessary on my own initiative. There was no question about it. My feelings were on the side of socialism, and had been for a long time. I just hadn't been aware of it. This political awareness, as he himself says, did not develop overnight. Instead, it was the culmination of a process that had begun in his childhood in Argentina. Félix Weil recounts how the striking contrast between rich and poor led him to question this inequality. In particular, his close and friendly relationship with an indigenous family employed in the Weil household in Buenos Aires had a strong influence on him. He critically questioned his father about the social differences between the two families. And according to his writings, he did not really accept them. In a total of 12 typewritten pages in his memories, Félix Weil attaches great importance to this family, especially since this contact obviously did not cease after he left Argentina. He also describes how his father enabled the family to build a new life for themselves by financing the establishment of a bakery and pastry shop with a cafe. Juana, in any case, was not only the cook in the Weil family household, but also his Indian nanny, as Félix Weil described her. Her husband, Jacinto, was employed as a butler and coachman. Their younger son, Antonio, was his schoolmate and became his most important childhood friend. The other son, Fernando, whom Félix Weil saw as an older brother, became an activist in the Agricultural Workers' Union. His highly risky activities and subsequent murder, as well as the continuation of his work by his younger brother, were fundamental to Félix Weil's identification with the interests of agricultural workers and his vehement opposition to large landowners, which stood in strong contrast to his own background and social reality. These experiences resulted in a pronounced disposition for social justice, which also became the driving force behind his political convictions. In addition to the key political experience in Frankfurt, one can speak here of a key social experience in Buenos Aires. Looking back at the Institute for Social Research, it's a prime example of the interplay between Marxism and education. Félix Weil founded the Institute as a platform for Marxist research and teaching, loosely affiliated with the university. He regarded Marxism not as a political orientation, but as a science, comparable to any other subject. In any case, the Institute's research into scientific Marxism made it unique, at least in Europe. As director of the Institute, Félix Weil had decided early in favor of Kurt Albert Gerlach. Gerlach had been strongly influenced by the University of Kiel and, above all, by its Institute for Maritime Transport and World Economy, which was an early center of German sociology. In 1922, he was finally appointed associate professor in economics in Frankfurt, where he met Félix Weil. Both shared the view that there was a major gap in the university landscape because there was nowhere to conduct Marxist research. There are also indications that the original idea for founding the institute came from Gerlach. Gerlach also wrote the memorandum on the founding of the institute, either alone or more likely together with Félix Weil. He was also heavily involved in the initial negotiations with the university, but then died of diabetes on October the 19th, 1922, during the foundation phase. Despite his early death, however, he is an important figure from the founding period who, like Félix Weil, is often neglected. Félix Weil was then able to recruit Karl Grünberg from Vienna as the first director. Grünberg held a chair in political economy and economic policy at the University of Vienna and had made a name for himself in the field of the history of socialism and the labor movement. The first Marxist Working Week in May 1923, financed by Félix Weil, is a prime example of for the diversity of Marxism approaches that were the subject of research and teaching at the Institute. The Institute had been founded 3 months earlier by a ministerial decree dated January the 23rd, 1923. The Institute building had not yet been opened. That happened until June 22 in 1924. They met in Geraberg, a village in Thuringia, presumably at as the Institute's first theory or orientation seminar, and people spent several days discussing different approaches. Félix Weil can be seen in this photo in the second row. He's the second person. From the right here. Second row at the edge. This is quite symbolic for the role he often played. He writes that he gave a lecture on the economic problems on the central planned economy. However, Georg Lukács and Karl Korsch are the focus of the photo and also of the meeting. You can see them here. That's Lukács standing and Korsch is here lying in the first row. They were among the most important innovators of Marxism in the 1920s. Lukács with his work Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein, and Korsch with Marxismus and Philosophy. This photo and the people depicted in it could be the subject of an evening-long discussion. For example, there is Richard Sorge standing to the left of Félix Weil. He was a member of the Communist Party, moved to the Soviet Union at the end of 1924, and during the Second World War, he set up a spy ring in Japan that discovered the date of the German invasion of the Soviet Union on June the 22nd, 1941. But Stalin didn't believe him. Sorge was exposed and executed by the Japanese and was later posthumously honored as a hero of the Soviet Union. In contrast, Karl August Wittfogel, front row, far left, it's this one here, he was also a member of the Communist Party and became a highly respected expert on Chinese society. But later he became an anti-communist in the post-war period in the United States and participated in the denunciations of the McCarthy era. Incidentally, Käthe Weil, Félix Weil's first wife, is also pictured to the right of Karl Korsch. She is sitting here. Although she had no official role at the Institute, she later became an important scientific contact for Max Horkheimer over a long period of time. And when it comes to Horkheimer, it's also interesting to note who is not on the photo. Apart from Pollock, who is standing in the second row, second from left, apart from him, no one is pictured who could be associated with the later Institute's development of critical theory. The history of this first institute was relatively short. In 1933, it was closed and confiscated by the National Socialists because, according to their reasoning and wording, it was a hotbed of pure Marxism with a strong communist influence. If you look closely at this photograph from March 1933, but you cannot see it, there is the swastika flag about the portal of the Institute. It's a picture from March 1933. The Institute fled via Geneva in Switzerland to New York and was located later in Columbia University building in a building from 1934 onwards, which is shown here at the bottom right. Felix Weil also worked there, but he had living in Buenos Aires again since 1930 or 1931, and then he moved to New York in 1936, where he rejoined the institute. However, he soon began to focus more and more on the recent history of his native Argentina. And when the institute and its inner circle relocated to Los Angeles, Félix Weil followed and also moved to the west coast of the USA in 1946. Meanwhile, the institute's building in Frankfurt was severely damaged by a bomb during the war, as can be seen here, and it was almost completely destroyed. In 1951, when the institute returned to Frankfurt, it therefore moved to a new building. And that's the institute as we know it today. Félix Weil was against this return to Germany, but he traveled from Los Angeles especially for the inauguration ceremony of the new building. In the photo of this celebration, he has his back to us. He's sitting here at the table. Left to him is Adorno, and we see Horkheimer at the head of the table. This second institute was now administratively and financially independent of Félix Weil. However, he never lost interest in it and remained in close contact, especially with Horkheimer, Pollock, and Adorno. However, he did move to Germany once again quite late in 1969. He became an employee of the United States Army and taught courses, gave lectures for Army personnel at the US Air Base Ramstein in Rhineland-Palatinate until 1973. And we can also see his course program here. It focused primarily on finance, taxation, and real estate in the United States. This job is quite controversial. It can be assumed that at that time, in the middle of the Cold War, there were not many Marxists working in the American army. Because at the same time as teaching, he tried to use his last money to revive Marxist research at the Institute for Social Research, which had fallen into the background in the meantime. But this did not work out, and finally he returned to the United States in 1973, where he died 2 years later in Dover, Delaware. Now I would like to discuss Félix Weil's activities, which make it clear that he cannot be limited to the Institute, even though it played a central role until the end of his life. The starting point for Félix Weil's political activities had been his participation in the November Revolution, which marked his political awakening. Subsequently, he founded the University of Frankfurt, where he had begun studying Staatswissenschaften, this is political science, in 1916. He found it too conservative, and he transferred to the University of Tübingen in Württemberg in the summer semester of 1919, because it offered courses on socialism. This was decisive for his further development, as it brought him into contact with the three people who had the greatest influence on him, politically and academically. And here we can see these three persons. First of all, there was Robert Wilbrandt, a social democrat and professor of economics who also offered courses on Marxism. He was a leading proponent of cooperative socialism, and it was probably through him that Félix Weil came to doubt planned economy models. And he also began his dissertation with Wilbrandt. We also saw Karl Korsch earlier in the photo of the first Marxist working week. He strongly influenced Félix Weil with his concept of practical socialism, which calls for active intervention in political developments. And Félix Weil was also close friends with Clara Zetkin, a founding member of the Communist Party and a women's rights activist. He met her at one of her lectures, which she had helped to organize. Through her, he became closer to the Communist Party. In Tübingen, Félix Weil was co-founder of a socialist university group. When it split, he belonged to the more radical Spartacist group and was subsequently arrested for his political activities and expelled from the federal state of Württemberg. He then continued his studies in Frankfurt and graduated with a doctorate in socialization with magna cum laude. And shortly after completing his studies in October 1920, that was, yes, it was the time when Félix Weil attended a conference of the Independent Social Democratic Party, which turned the Communist Party into a mass organization when the left-wing group joined the Communists. And there, as we heard earlier, in Halle, in Saxony-Anhalt, he must have had a conversation with Grigory Zinoviev, the head of the Communist International, who was one of the main speakers at the conference. And as a result, we heard of it this evening, he became the Comintern delegate for Argentina with a personal recommendation from Zinoviev. And this is the first report to Moscow, which he opens with the words, "Dear Comrade Zinoviev, I hereby report my arrival. I have established contact with the local party." He concludes, it's hard to see, with com.gruß, that means communist greeting, and he signs with b.lucio, as we heard, it was his alias, which he chose for himself, but this was, to be honest, not very cryptic, because we heard of it. Lucio was one of his 3 first names, which he didn't like, and he later discarded when he became a naturalized citizen of the United States. Maybe that's the reason why he chose his name. He didn't like it. And with Beatus, he reflected on his school days, because he signed a few essays with Beatus Quia, which is the Latin translation of his name, Félix Weil, also not cryptic at all. In any case, this, we heard of it, I don't have to repeat it. It's focused on the question of which organization and parties should be admitted to the Comintern, but I think we heard we had a very good analysis of what he did in Argentina. Maybe one interesting point is, I don't know if you mentioned it, because my Spanish is not very good. I could follow a little bit. The basics of the workers' movement book were these reports he sent to Moscow. I studied them all. Did you have the opportunity to study the reports? No. In the State Archive of Moscow, you can find all the 11 reports Félix Weil sent to Moscow, and for me it was very exciting to read it in German. He wrote in German to Zinoviev, because Zinoviev, he wrote to him personally, Lieber Genosse Zinoviev. For me, it was astonishing that reading the labor worker movement book for Argentina and reading these reports, it's partly it's the same. It's that's to say, he published his reports, and one report he sent directly, one to Moscow, another one he sent to Vienna to be published in Rote Fahne. That was, I think you know it, that was the newspaper of the Communist Party. For me, it was very astonishing. His official reason for his stay in Argentina at this time could not be more controversial, because at his father's request, he immersed himself more deeply in the family business at that time. So he had his 2 jobs, doing the family job, working for the Weil Hermanos Compañía, and at the same time, he was an agent for the Soviets. Then a few years later, we too heard of it. I don't go into details now. Worked for the Argentine government and had his first opportunity to shape policy. The reason why he came back, maybe it's important. He had come back to Buenos Aires in 1930 or 1931. It's not quite sure, to restructure the family business against the backdrop of the global economic crisis. that was the reason that he came here, and originally he wanted to stay here only 3 months, as he writes in his memories. And then we heard of it this evening. Then he came in contact with, he called it the Brain Trust, a group of reformers, liberal reformers who wanted to reform the state, and we heard of it. Then the result was the income tax. There's also an amazing point, because Félix Weil writes very clearly in his memories, I wrote the income tax. He describes the process, that he made a proposal when it's the right time, before the elections, and then he said he was asked how much time do we need, then he answered 3 days, and then he writes that he went to the Tigre River, took a boat from his cousin, and with 2 secretaries in 3 days he wrote the income tax. Why do I tell this? Because I read almost the same story in an interview by Prebisch. There is I forgot the publication. There is there was made an interview with Prebisch by a Mexican journalist in the 1970s. I will remember the name of the book. And Prebisch, he writes or says almost the same. He says, I need 3 days, and I can write it, and I had the idea to make the proposal before the elections the same, and it's amazing. So for me, it was very difficult to find out the truth, because I'm no specialist in Argentinian history and so on, and in this point, for me, it was very helpful, the book by Mario Rapoport, to which I'm referring, and I'm very thankful for him that he describes the process, because I understood a little bit more what happened, and together with a letter of Malacorte, I could a little bit see clearer, but it's amazing. 2 people say the same. Okay. This photo I found very interesting. It was taken at this time. It's a photo he sent to George Gross in the United States, and it's a pity that you cannot see him in a better quality. But if you had a better quality, you could see that he is armed with a pistol. So on the right, on the left side, yes. There's a pistol, and maybe this was necessary because he. It's much better. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. The final slide.
So maybe it was necessary because, as he writes in his memories, he says that he was under serious threat due to his reforms, his tax reforms. And he himself reports of an assassination attempt. And at the same time, he was also in close contact with Ernesto Alemann, the editor of the daily newspaper Argentinisches Tageblatt, which took a strong stand against National Socialism. And Ernesto Alemann was also the central figure in the founding of the anti-National Socialist Pestalozzi school, to which Félix Weil made a financial contribution. It was a foundation to the National Socialist and anti-Semitic German schools in Buenos Aires at that time. And from 1933 onwards, Félix Weil lived in the new built Edificio Sáfico at Corrientes for 456. He lived there together with his second wife, Margot Jacobi de Weil, and her daughter Ursula from her first marriage. And we visited it tomorrow, and I'm more or less convinced that this was the previously location of the headquarters of Weil Hermanos y Compañía, because the sources I saw, they had the same addresses, Weil Hermanos y Compañía, and later on the Sáfico building, but Valeria told us
different story.
A different story this morning. I can't decide it. I can't decide it. And this second skyscraper in Buenos Aires with apartments and offices was built as a result of the company's restructuring when Félix Weil consistently promoted to give up the grain trade. The grain trade was abundant and investments were made in real estate, livestock farming and industrial holdings. And Félix Weil had the top 3 floors converted into his penthouse apartment. And photos of this also have been preserved, so we can take a look inside. So it's to say that he lived at the top. These were the 1, 2, 3, the 23, 24, 25th floor. They were combined to each other. And we have photos of this time and of his apartment. These 2, for example. On the left side, that's the living room of his wife, of Margit Jacobi. And on the right side, we have the room of Félix Weil with his library. And the photographs are from the year 1934. And it's really the apartment in which he lived. I have these photos of a journal. It's called Architectura. It's from 1934. It was a special addition to the building, and you can read in the article that that Félix Weil was the man who wanted to have this apartment, and all the interior was made by Margot Jacobi, and it's difficult to see. It's the German Bauhaus style. You say Art Deco. I think it's a better expression, no? Art Deco? Bauhaus? It's Bauhaus, okay. What's interesting to know is that Félix Weil always had little contact with his family in Buenos Aires. There lived a lot of family members, but normally he had little contact. But there's also one rare photo which shows him surrounded by family members to be exactly these almost all are cousins. And this was the photo was taken at this time. You can see Félix Weil seated in the front. It's this person here, and that's his wife, Margot Jacobi. And also, these photos were also taken at that time. This is a whole series. There are existing more pictures like this. A whole series of a mud bath in the Tigre River. Which also, that's why I show it to you. These pictures also underline Félix Weil's somewhat unconventional character, because I can't imagine that, for example, Horkheim or Pollock take a mud bath in the Tigre River. They had a totally different character. And he's hardly to recognize. It's this one, always on the far right side, with the hat on the head, and he's wearing glasses. If you see them in original, in a better quality, they're quite funny, these pictures. And this was the last extended Argentine period in Félix Weil's life, and it ended on November the 26th in 1935. Then he left for New York, where the Institute for Social Research was meanwhile located. But Félix Weil was also politically active in the United States, and he became, in California in the 1960s, an expert on tax issues at a local and state level. There he also supported the Democratic Party and was registered to vote. Here, for example, you see an election advertisement, and he supported the Democratic candidate in his district for the 1966 gubernatorial election. And you can see him here in this advertisement. Here is the last one who signed. And this shows that also in the States, in Los Angeles, where he lived, he was yes, he was a prominent person, because you see that, for example, the mayor counted to the supporters, and he was known. He had a reputation in Los Angeles, and I saw a lot of newspaper articles in which he's mentioned in his role as an expert for tax issues. This entire spectrum of political activity was very heterogeneous, and Félix Weil's role as a patron of the arts was equally diverse. He attempted to convey his political ideas by promoting art, theater, literature, and probably also film. In this way, he wanted to expand the academic target group limited to the institute, and he wanted also to reach the educated middle class. With this in mind, he supported George Grosz and his socially critical paintings. There again we have a photo. It's Félix Weil and George Grosz. Félix Weil is the person left, George Grosz is right. And this was taken in Portofino, Italy, in the summer of 1922. And at that time, George Grosz was already known as a socially critical painter, but he was, typically for an artist, he was constantly worried about money. And Félix Weil first invited him on a vacation to get to know him personally, and then he supported him financially for many years. And George Grosz also painted this famous portrait of Félix Weil, which remained in his private collection for almost 50 years. However, Félix Weil was never interested in art as an investment. He was never concerned with aesthetics. He was only concerned with political statements. And this became very clear when a heated argument developed between the two when Grosz, in exile in the United States, gave up his socially critical painting. And this person, this is Erwin Piscator, and he was the most prominent director of political theater in Germany in the 1920s. However, his productions were technically very complex and therefore very costly. And when his theater ran out of money, Félix Weil stepped in and financed Walter Mehring's play Der Kaufmann von Berlin. And this is, I think you know him, this is Sergei Eisenstein. Félix Weil writes that he also contributed to the purchase of the performance rights for Sergei Eisenstein's revolutionary film Battleship Potemkin for German-speaking countries. And but this episode is one of the few points in his memories that cannot be verified by other sources. And since all other patronage activities can be proven beyond doubt, it is entirely plausible that he was involved in some way. If it's true, he was involved in a milestone of film history. In contrast, Félix Weil's role as a publisher can be clearly reconstructed. He was significantly involved in 3 publishing houses. Malik Verlag was the most renowned publisher of avant-garde literature in Germany in the 1920s. However, it also had constant financial problems. And Félix Weil ultimately injected so much money that he effectively owned the publishing house from 1925 onwards. The artistically sophisticated book covers became the publishing house's trademark. On the cover of a novel by Upton Sinclair, which we see here on the right, that's a photo montage by John Hartfield. You can also see Félix Weil here. He climbs on the dollar sign. It's the person here on the bottom. And that's a typical role for him. Wieland Hetzfelde, for example, said that Félix Weil is a patron of the art who works, he co-works, and this is one example. He did not only give the money, but he also wanted to be active in all the projects he did, and that's the reason that he participated here on this photo montage. The Soziologische Verlagsanstalt was founded by Félix Weil in 1929 to publish scientific and political literature that did not fit in with the Malik Verlag. And finally, the Marx-Engels Archivverlagsgesellschaft was a joint project of the Institute for Social Research and the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow. And Félix Weil was managing director together with Friedrich Pollock. The aim was to publish the first complete edition of Marx and Engels' works, and in 1927 the first half-volume appeared, before the collaboration came to an end. Finally, Félix Weil was also an author himself. He wrote 5 books and around 30 magazines and newspaper articles. In addition, there is his unpublished autobiography and a study entitled The Social Function of the Race Philosophy in Nazi Germany, which was only published as a facsimile edition now shortly in December 2024. So, you know his magnus opus, we can say his magnus opus was Argentine Riddle from 1944. I don't have to go into details. The only thing which was for me interesting I want to mention, I think it's clear from this book that Félix Weil assumed a classic way for the development of states and societies, because we heard of it, he regarded industrialization and as an indispensable key and a necessary phase in Argentina's future's democratic development. But that was for me very interesting, that he was proposing a classic way of development, that he regarded industrialization in any means as necessary, that you can leave it. Then we heard of it, that's the Geschichte der Arbeiterbewegung in Argentinien, then his dissertation. Maybe it's interesting for you that the book was rediscovered in Germany in the 1968 movement and was then reprinted as a pirate edition in West Berlin. And the other 2 books, they deal with tax issues. In 1933, I think you mentioned it, he wrote a publication on the new income tax in Argentina, a commentary on the law. And in 1967, he published a guide for property taxpayers in California, in the United States. And now an important point, Félix Weil, as these publications alone show, was not a proponent of critical theory, about which he expressed negative views toward the end of his life. And there are a lot of negative utterances in his memories, and I chose one. It's this one. For example, he wrote, Horkheimer succeeded in doing the almost impossible. He invented a social philosophy, a love affair between philosophy and sociology. And unfortunately, he did not create anything good with it. It was, as I suddenly realized, a departure from pure science into the vagueness of a gray area. It distracted some young people from their intended studies and led them into mindless resistance. Very, very strong words, harsh words, and it's only an example. In his memories, he writes several pages like this, and very hard formulated. And he includes Pollock in his critique. But he formulated his harsh criticism on both after both had already passed away. It's a very important point. Because prior to that, there were no signs of alienation or condemnation of the direction taken under Horkheimer. And instead, Félix Weil worked at the Institute in the United States repeatedly when critical theory began to take shape. And he collaborated, albeit not in a leading role, but he collaborated on the Institute's research and publications, which became famous. Noteworthy examples include the anti-Semitism projects in collaboration with the Jewish Labor Committee and the American Jewish Congress. And for the authoritarian personality, also a major work of critical theory and part of the 5-volume Studies in Prejudice, he took on extensive editorial work and coordinated the contribution of the various authors. And he translated and edited another volume in this series, The Rehearsal for Destruction by Paul Messing, for publication in German. And Félix Weil, also important, was also involved in some important theoretical discussions, for example, about authoritarianism and state capitalism. And this is also evident in some of his own publications, in the terminology he uses. This you can also see in Argentine Riddle. You see some expressions, some explanations which remember of these discussions. But now, in conclusion, as a brief summary, I would like to note that Félix Weil's life was, yes, it was full of changes, but in my eyes, ultimately, it was consistent. Why? Because he remained a socialist and Marxist throughout his life, with an unshakable belief in the power of education and formation. And what at first glance may appear to be a mystery or enigma or perhaps a contradiction, these were areas of tension in which Félix Weil operated. It was a life strongly influenced by the age of extremes, as Eric Hobsbawm called the short 20th century. And Félix Weil's biography, in my eyes, contributes to our understanding of this period, with all its drama, its catastrophes, but also with its possibilities and opportunities. And his credibility was enhanced by the fact that he spent almost all his entire fortune on his political ideas. To a certain extent, he was either a capitalist Marxist or a Marxist capitalist. And today, Félix Weil would best be described as an undogmatic left-wing intellectual, or perhaps more aptly as someone who was out of the ordinary. And with that, I would like to conclude and thank you very much for listening and for your patience and for my English, for my bad English. And I look forward to your question and hope that I can answer it.
May I speak in Spanish and maybe you can translate it?
You sure?
I speak in Spanish. Okay. Dos cosas. Creo que para explicar estos años 30 en Argentina, que todavía yo tengo aparece citado por ahí que él participó en las conferencias del Pestalozzi. Ahí habría algo para rastrear, para seguir pensando esto de que no era judío, no se sentía judío, pero por otro lado la trama liberal de inmigrantes alemanes en la que él participa en los 30, que es esta trama antifascista, no se definen judíos, pero vuelve a repetirse una sensibilidad judía, una afinidad, letrados judíos. Y ahí me parece que yo empecé a mirar el Tageblatt a ver si encontraba, yo creo que debe haber publicaciones de él que están todavía por allá. Eso es una.
Achso, das ist verstanden. Also das sind so ein bisschen die 30er Jahre im Umfeld von der Pestalozzi-Schule, ob er da, also Sie hat eine starke Vermutung, dass er sehr stark dort auch präsent war und dass möglicherweise vielleicht noch die eine oder andere Veröffentlichung von ihm im Tageblatt gefunden werden könnte. Ne?
Yeah, my intuition is there is a conference. There is he took place not only like finances, but also as intellectual. There are intellectual rules that we maybe can profundizar. And the second is the previous relationship. I think that the Augusto Bunge relationship is the key to understand the participation in Socialist Party, Independent Socialist Party, because Augusto Bunge was socialist, economist socialist, and he speak Germany, and I think there was intellectual understanding. And Bunge se va del partido get out of Socialist Party in the same time that Weil in 1935, and it's intuition too. Therefore, Prebisch is against Weil, because Prebisch stay in the party and Augusto Bunge get out. And there are, because Weil was difficult people too for the relationship, lo que leías sobre Horkheimer y todo eso. Y la pelea con Lisandro de la Torre del 39 también tiene que ver con esa trama de sociabilidad, creo. Porque en el Tratado de la Carne, Lisandro de la Torre es sumamente agresivo con Pinedo y Malacorto, y ahí en ese momento Weil parece que queda del lado de Pinedo y Malacorto. Entonces, después cuando se va, bueno, todo eso. Yo creo que ahí hay una trama que es política y que es de enemistades, porque en el 1939 Weil podía explicar la economía de guerra alemana sin pelearse con Lisandro de la Torre, y no le aportaba nada pelearse con Lisandro de la Torre, simplemente defender su teoría política, su teoría económica y listo. Y él ahí lo hace, yo creo que ahí hay junta una amistad con Lisandro de la Torre, que venía de la impugnación al impuesto a las ganancias. Porque todo el asesinato en el Senado, el Tratado de la Carne, tiene que ver porque aplican mal el impuesto al rédito que supuestamente había diseñado Weil. Entonces, ahí hay una rueda.
Also auch nochmal ein ganz anderes Feld, so die
Auseinandersetzung.
Also irgendwie die Besteuerung von den Fleischausfuhren, die Auseinandersetzung um wirtschaftspolitische Ausrichtung mit Lisandro de la Torre und dem Plan Pinedo. Also das waren so richtig quasi Auseinandersetzungen über die wirtschaftspolitische Orientierung in Argentinien und dass er dort ja auch ein Gesetzesvorhaben quasi mitentwickelt hatte, weil la pregunta era
because I don't read the autobiography. That's our intuition about when I read the intervention. But maybe in the autobiography you can more information about Lisandro de la Torre. I think they had they feel enemy Lisandro de la Torre, and two, Prebisch no lo nombra directamente a Prebisch en la autobiografía.
Yes, that's true, but let's see, I try to answer your questions. The first question was...
I'm sorry, do you want to collect some questions, or do you want
No, it's okay.
It's up to you. What do you prefer?
It's okay.
Okay.
So, to Pestalozzi's school, I only found in the sources and in his writings two kinds of relationship to the school. The first one was that he gave a donation when it was founded. When it was founded by the circle from Ernesto Alemann, he was the driving force behind it, and they were close friends, both. And the other one is that sure he gave a lecture in the Pestalozzi School when he was there in the end of the 30s. He gave a lecture about the differences between National Socialism and Bolshevism. Because at that time, and it's interesting because at that time a lot of people saw it the same dictatorship, which there was no difference. And it's an interesting point, Lisandro della Torre, because Félix Weil, when he gave his lecture, he says that Lisandro della Torre was one of the people who made this Gleichsetzung, this identification of both. And it's very interesting because we have a newspaper article about this lecture he gave, and it's very interesting to read how exactly Félix Weil explains the differences. But these are the only two things I found. Of course, I can imagine that he had more connections to the school, maybe more influence, but I cannot say it because I have no sources. I'm a historian, I'm a scientist, and I have to work on what I have, and I don't incline to speculation. Sometimes it's allowed when you can formulate ideas, but then you have to prove it, your ideas, and I cannot say more. About you asked about more articles in Argentinisches Tageblatt. It's difficult to do this research. I did 2 times. I was in the archive in Berlin, where in Germany I can read the Argentinisches Tageblatt, and it took days because Félix Weil says I wrote several articles. Okay. So I tried to find them, and to be honest, before I published my book, I found only 2 or 3, and I was interested in another topic after I finished my PhD, my book, and then again I did some research, and I found, to be honest, 5 or 6 more articles which were hidden, and I went through these newspapers very deeply, but yes, sure, maybe I oversaw more of them.
This is interesting from argentinische Weil in Argentina.
Sorry?
That is interesting, more circulation
Okay.
as intellectual, I think.
Yes, sure. And the other point, the connection of you asked the connection of Félix Weil to Lisandro della Torre and the laws for the export of Fleisch, yes, of meat. Carne. What I found hints that I don't know if you know the letter of Malacorto when he writes that Félix Weil had difficulties with the administration, and Malacorto writes that these difficulties were the reason that he stopped his work for the government. Do you know the letter of Malacorto?
No.
So in this letter he writes that Félix Weil he took documents to which he was not allowed, and to regulate some things for the Weil Hermanos Company, and this was found out, and Malacorto writes that it had to do with meat export, and that's the only thing I can say. And now I make a speculation. Because the Weil Hermanos Company they changed the fields. At this time they had cattle and land, and maybe that's the kernel of it. That at this time he wanted to find out some details, and so he took to him. He only wanted to have some information. He didn't want to make fraud.
Yes, I know this letter.
And you know this letter, and
but
this I can imagine. But also this is a speculation, because it's a pity that Malocotto doesn't write what were the facts. He only writes that he had difficulties.
But you showed the photo with the pistol, and there was few months ago was the assassinate in the parliament
of Lisandro de la Torre.
The secretary, and all that el autor intelectual era Malacorto, supuestamente acusado. Yo digo, por eso me parece como que algo de la carne tiene que estar ahí, tal vez. ¿Eh?
And I know, and I also know, but I'm no expert for Argentinian history, but I also know that Pinedo and Duhau, they had a trial, referring to there was a scandal with a British ship, I can't remember the name, and both of them had a trial, and sure, I can imagine, because Félix Weil was close to them, that he was involved in a certain way. The interesting point is that from one day to another, as it seems, Félix Weil gave up his positions, and he only writes to Horkheimer after he gave up his positions. Oh, I gave up my positions, and it was too much to do. But he doesn't name the reasons. And sure, this could be the reason that he had difficulties.
Thank you.
Tenemos poco tiempo, ¿no? Entonces tal vez podemos hacer 2-3 preguntas cortitas, ¿no? So, okay. Sí.
Yo tenía...
Bien cortitas, ¿no? Telegráfico. Sí, dale.
Two questions. One, if the perception of Judaism in Weil changed after the Nazi genocide, if he identifies or not as a Jewish, more after the Nazism and the creation of Israel as a state, and if he has some political position over the events in the 60s, like Vietnam, the Cuban Revolution, the civil rights in America, and that very briefly.
The second question, you're gathering?
A couple of questions, if you agree, because we don't have much time.
Could I have your...
I have a question, Hans-Peter.
Yes.
So at first, your presentation was very interesting. I enjoyed it. I wrote down some details to remember. I'm interested to the historical role of Kurt Albert Gerlach, the friend of the Félix Weil and the one of the first figures of the institute. Well, I know he was a German sociologist, and he studied the trade unions and labor laws in Denmark, in Europe. In biography of Weil, you wrote that Gerlach was supposed to be the first director, but well, he died young and suddenly in October 1922. Well, then the first director became the Austro-Marxist
Grünberg.
Karl Grünberg. Okay, one hypothesis is that Gerlach might have led the institute in another way, in other direction, the one later shaped by Max Horkheimer. My question is, what more do we know about Gerlach's ideas and political position in the last year of his life, and what about his relation with Félix Weil? Because there is a relation between Gerlach and Richard Solveig.
Mhm.
That's all.
Questions?
Sí, sí existe alguna conexión sobre la interpretación que Weil es solo un mecenas del Instituto de Frankfurt, si existe una conexión con la vida y el modus operandi de los intelectuales que forman el instituto. Me refiero a Pollock y a Horkheimer.
Also ob es eine Verbindung gibt quasi zwischen dem Lebensstil von Weil und den anderen Kompanien. Pollock y Horkheimer. Si hay una relación entre la...
Sí, existe una relación entre el descrédito de Weil solo como financista, originada en estos dos autores,
que supuestamente ellos hicieron esos reproches.
a partir de algunas notas.
Genau, also quasi zwischen diesem Negativ-Image von Weil, dass er nur der Mäzenat war und nicht mehr, und zwischen dem, dass quasi Horkheimer und Pollock diese Negativ, also inwiefern die das befördert hätten, quasi diese Wahrnehmung von...
Okay. Also inwiefern die beiden praktisch die Ursache dafür sind, dass Félix Weil dieses schräge Bild hat.
Ob es da eine Beziehung gibt.
Ja, okay.
I think that we are done because...
Okay. So I begin with the first questions. Much more easier to answer is what is the attitude of Félix Weil to Vietnam, all the things you asked, to Vietnam, to the anti-colonial movements and so on. There, in this respect, in this sense, he says us nothing. He doesn't say something about Vietnam, and he also says only a few words to the development in Eastern Europe, for example. The only thing he says or he writes that's very interesting, he liked the development in Yugoslavia, and he liked it because they had a third way, and so there he saw some details of his economic ideas. He had the idea that planned economy cannot function, and he saw how in Yugoslavia they try another way, because at this time it was allowed a little bit private property and so on. But he writes not much about Eastern Europe. He didn't like, for example, the Soviet Union, the development there, but he writes not much. To Judaism, if I interpret your question correctly, you asked what role Judaism had for him after the beginning of National Socialism.
If it changed.
If it changed, yes, it changed.
The genocide, like.
Yes, it changed because at the beginning it was normal for members of the institute. Anti-Semitism was no topic for them, because they thought that anti-Semitism is part of the crisis of capitalism, and if capitalism disappears, it would be the same with anti-Semitism. Very naive in our days, but it was the way they thought. Of course, the situation changed when National Socialism came to power, but not at the beginning. The attitudes changed when the World War began, and when the crimes of the Germans in Eastern Europe and with the concentration camps became known. Then the attitude changed, and then you I've got the impression that the minds changed, and that was the reason that they then began to write and to do research about anti-Semitism and fascism. For example, at this time he very famous thing, his explanation of the fascism sui generis. Then, although in his work Argentine Riddle he described anti-Semitism and so on, and that's clear that the historical development had an influence on the attitude. And there is the last thing I want to say is that you have a very interesting correspondence between Weil and Horkheimer in 1942. I think it was March 1942, and it was very defeatist what Félix Weil wrote. For example, it's not worth do much more work because in 2 or 3 years we all are in the concentration camps and so on. And so you have the impression, you can read that the attitude changed totally. And okay, this is. I hope this answers the question. So now on the question was Gerlach to what was his role exactly in the founding period, and you asked if the development would have been otherwise. Yes, sure, of course. Gerlach was, for me, he was the driving force in developing the ideas, because you can compare the Institut für Maritime, Institut für Seeverkehr und Weltwirtschaft, is it in German, Institute for Maritime Transport and World Economy. This institute was similar to the Institute for Social Research in its structure, in its doing research. It was pluralistic. It was loosely connected to the university, and I'm convinced that the structure of the Institute for Social Research, which you can read in the Denkschrift, in the memorandum, is highly influenced by Gerlach's experiences in Kiel. So for me, it's clear. Also, if you can read the program. There are so much points which are the same, so that the influence for bringing it into a shape is, for me, clearly comes from Gerlach, and he was a historical materialist, the same as Grünberg, and he himself describes him as an radical communist, materialist, and so on. And of course, the development had been otherwise when he had the opportunity to lead the institute, because Grünberg was similar. He also was a historical materialist. They had the same line, and they were there was no difference between Grünberg and Weil, but the disadvantage was that Grünberg was very old. And so he's born in 1867, I have in mind. He was very old when he came to Frankfurt, and he became ill in the founding phase, in the early phase, and was then several times replaced by Pollock, who leaded it. And then came Horkheimer. And for me, it's clear that the direction they now went was totally different. Because at the same time, Félix Weil, he moved to Berlin, he left Frankfurt, and so Horkheimer had free hand to do what he wanted. But on the other hand, if you read, for example, there's a long letter which Félix Weil wrote to the Russian Minister for Culture, a long letter of 30 pages, in this letter, in 1929, Félix Weil describes what the Institute is doing. And there you can also see that you have the first roots of critical theory with the interdisciplinarity. There's also a section for sociology and so on. So at this time, it's a little bit different because the roots were laid before Horkheimer. But to bring it to an end, I'm convinced that Gerlach would have made the Institute different. And the last one was the relationship from Pollock, Horkheimer, and Weil to explain why Weil had formulated these harsh words, right?
Yes.
Reading the memories, I've got the impression that there was one thing which Félix Weil made angry after both had died. There were two German biographers or scientists who wrote a biography of Horkheimer. And in this biography, they quote Horkheimer and Pollock with the words, Félix Weil was the man with the money, and like everybody who has a lot of money, he can also found an institute, but he was never interested in the institute's work. And Félix Weil read this, he saw this sentences, and that was, in my eyes, the reason that he became angry, and he tells us in his memories that he heard such things also from other people. And I think when you read statements of Pollock and Horkheimer, also of Adorno, what they uttered about Félix Weil, it was what means kränkend, it was herabsetzend,
Despectivo. Pejorativo sobre él.
And,
Esa
but,
degradación
yes.
de Weil a un mero financista y no a un intelectual. El no reconocimiento de Weil como intelectual, que incluso lo podemos ver a través de la negativa de firmar como miembro del Instituto de Frankfurt su libro The Argentine Way.
Totalmente correcto. It was Pollock who uttered a very bad opinion about Argentine riddle, and it's polemic because Pollock says it's no good work because you can only write a good work if you have a material which is some years old. But it's nonsense. If you write, you all know it. If you write a work about Zeitgeschichte, about things which pass at this time, you can go to archives and look for things which are 10 years old. It's very polemic, and he wrote this additionally to Félix Weil's wife. And yes, but this is only one example, and you are totally right that he was scientifically, he was. No, we cannot say he was not estimated. They uttered these sentences because on the other side, Horkheimer was very, very interested that Félix Weil as well as Pollock work with Dialektik der Aufklärung. He urged Félix Weil because Félix Weil was highly estimated as an economist, and Horkheimer knew his capacities, and he wanted both to participate in this great work, Dialectic of Enlightenment. So you see, and that makes it worse. They knew his qualities, but they neglected it. And Adorno, the same. Adorno's he wrote about Félix Weil and terrible things. For example, when when Félix Weil wanted to, or it was spoken about Félix Weil to translate Paul Massing's work into German, Adorno tried to avoid this, and the reasons are also you cannot accept these reasons.